Right. Excellent. Thanks for waiting. We have actually more people online, which is good news. I mean, or bad news, or both than we have here. Anyway, I'm very happy to introduce for our ongoing seminar on politics of the Anthropocene. Our speaker of today, Professor Orit Halpern. Orit has come here from Technische Universität Dresden, where she holds the position of Chair of Digital Cultures in the Institute of German Studies and Media Cultures. Orit graduated from and defended her PhD at Harvard, and then she held numerous visiting and other positions and fellowships, including Max Planck Institute for History of Science in Berlin and others. Taught in Canada and the States, and now she has moved to Germany and is visiting us here. So please.
A pleasure. Thank you so much, Alexander, for the introduction, and all of you for being here, and all of you online for also attending. This is really wonderful to have the opportunity to present to you, and also particularly to a group that's specifically working on Anthropocene and politics, obviously pressing question today. So without further ado, I'm going to talk about a history of both ecology and economy as related to this term resilience, which has taken enormous and central role in urban planning, strategic management, business, as well as finance. So one of the things that got me onto, I'm wondering if people can hear me.
Yeah.
Because I'm muted and have the sound off on my machine, but so what got me onto resilience was working on smart cities, including cities like what you're looking at behind me, which is Rajat 5 in Kolkata in India. And this has been designated one of Modi's sort of kind of smart cities as part of kind of an Indian national program. And you see these fancy kind of high-tech developments being built on top of this area called the East Kolkata wetlands. It's a critical part of the Sundarbans, which is kind of a mangrove and sort of wetland zone. It's basically the only coastal defense for both Kolkata and Dhaka against sea level rise, but is also Kolkata has no central water management or water processing, and this is essentially the only water management. Essentially, these wetlands clean the water from this entire city that has tens of millions of residents. It's also a major site of protein production and like local fishery, and there's this whole sort of like agricultural and food production kind of relying on this. But the issue is that this major and very important ecological area is kind of being threatened by these construction sites that are supposedly being built in the name of smartness and greenness, as well as kind of the future of this high-tech economy that India envisions for all of it. And there's also, of course, as with all these sort of major infrastructure developments in locations like India, a massive amount of dispossession. So probably about 30,000 people were dispossessed immediately to produce this kind of new zone, if you will, for smartness. And so these are the kind of sites that I've been thinking about in terms of how environment, economy, and infrastructure and technology are intersecting in our present and what these kind of discourses are doing. And of course, I've worked on other places and tying into the theme. This is Songdo in South Korea. Anyone who knows my work knows I do a lot. So this is an ubiquitous or another smart city greenfield built out, kind of grafted out of the South China Sea, but it both serves kind of, it's supposedly totally also green, and they relocated the UN sort of environmental agency for Asia there, and there's this whole performance around this. even though, again, it's vulnerable to sea level rise. But it's also, of course, geopolitically strategic, sitting almost on the border with North Korea. So these are all parts of kind of large-scale infrastructure projects that are negotiating political, environmental, and economic concerns around kind of impending crisis in different ways than we're going to talk about today. So a lot of this work comes out of a recent book I just wrote with Rob Mitchell, but it's also part of a new set of projects that I'm looking at about extreme infrastructures and the management of futurity at planetary scales. But to get started with talking about resilient futures, so today we appear to be in an era beset by catastrophic events, pandemics, anti-democratic insurrections, wars, climate change. If there's a seemingly unique feature, though, to this ongoing array of volatility, violence, and war, however, it's their seeming banality and ubiquity. These ongoing events appear to evade historical demarcation soon after they emerge as events, either revolutionary or catastrophic, and certainly that's visible from within the discourses of especially corporations I'm going to talk about today. Replacing such historical demarcation, terms such as the new normal and even next normal circulate, and certainly did quite avidly after the pandemic. Ad nauseum through news outlets and social networks, in turn, policymakers, psychologists, ecologists, and business strategists all urge making systems, institutions, and even human subjects, so everything from democratic resilience to logistical chains resilience to biodiversity resilience, and even of course psychologically we're all supposed to become resilient. We're all supposed to be able to weather constant uncertainty and precarity as a kind of now naturalized state. So we're all supposed to become resilient, capable of enduring, and even profiting from change and crisis. For example, in the last Davos conference, not this one that was just held in, but the one held in a year before, the World Economic Forum in 2022 announced that resilience would become one of the central concepts organizing global response to the war in Ukraine, climate change, and the after effects of COVID pandemic. The forum identified a series of central challenges, or quote unquote frontier risks, that accompanied these. And it's really interesting, that term frontier risk. And I was actually asked to be on this frontier risk working group, which was a kind of fascinating, I don't think they listened to a word I said, but it was a fascinating ethnographic example about like all these people planning for like worst case scenarios all the time. But the fact that it's a frontier risk, and of course, you know, in some sense, what I'm saying kind of echoes the disaster capitalism discourse that we have, but now it's just out in the open. No one even pretends it's a frontier that we have to command, if you will. So rapid technological change. So the things that our little working group came up with were things like rapid technological change, climate disturbances, economic volatility and disparity, nuclear war, and balkanization all rose to the very top of these frontier risks. These risks, if not managed correctly or even capitalized upon, would pose dangers to globalization and, of course, plural democracy. Institutions therefore had to become resilient. As the president of international markets at Dell Technologies, Angus Haggerty, put it at Davos, we need digital resilience. Digital resilience positions an enterprise to pivot fast, adapt to fluid conditions, maintain seamless business continuity, and capitalize on opportunities. And of course, central to that is also cybersecurity and securitization. So predictably, this new form of flexible management and ability to innovate and capitalize on high-risk frontier risks is also, of course, closely linked to digital technologies and the application of AI and big data into into organizational management. Obviously, this is clearly an interest for the Dell Corporation, so I'm not gonna, pretend this is some sort of objective discussion, but what I want to highlight is kind of this transformed discourse on management around constant plasticity and flexibility and fluidity, and of course and its relationship, of course, to topics that probably are of interest to many people here, such as securitization. So while resilience might commonly be thought as psychological or environmental attribute, the forum highlights the new centrality of the term to organizing political economy. And as discourses of resilience imply, the idea that we now live in a world with constant technical innovation and regular trauma appears natural. So what is at stake in this discussion? That's why I suddenly have a normal curve from the 19th century appears how we understand social, natural, and technological change. So how is change itself understood and modeled? The very idea of the normal curve, which we now have the next normal, new normal, what have you, was an invention of 19th century human sciences underpinning contemporary understandings of nature, economy, population, and race. So we have kind of classically eugenic charts that sort of produce the idea of normal and abnormal bodies, this being Francis Galton. So the order of nature would be replicated with the order of society, but the normal is also embedded in concepts of evolution. Here we have Darwin's little preliminary charts. How did systems change? And when did events happen? Were extinction events normal or part of a regularly occurring kind of process? If the concept of revolution was the central organizing concept for change, whether in a capitalism modeled on reductive ideas of evolutionary fitness or in Marxism through dialectical contest, the concept of both constantly evolving but never revolutionary systems appears novel. So it seems to contrast with these previous older ideas, right? And this has been said many times, but there seems to be something happening at a very fundamental level that we need to be thinking about. So if nature is no longer untouched by technology, then we might ask what new concepts of history, governance, and technology are emerging. My intent is to briefly historically situate this new nature and new normal and its relationship to managing risk, and to begin thinking about some of these new ideas about evolution, such as symbiosis, Gaia theory that kind of assumes a sort of intersection between the inorganic and the organic, and kind of transformed time scales as well of how we're thinking about human action. And obviously all these new models of evolution also come with the very concept of the Anthropocene itself as an emerging kind of historical category, right? But to begin, volatility and uncertainty were, of course, not always considered norms of nature, not even in recent history. I'm not going to go back to the 19th century. For me, this is going to start in the post-World War moment, when ideas of communication and information and control first entered how we model and think about ecology, and where in many ways, even though the ideas of ecosystems and ecology, of course, go back to Haeckel and also to Townsley and all sorts of colonial British enterprises. I'm going to start our story, if we will, with individuals such as Hutchinson, an American ecologist here, who began to introduce cybernetics into their modeling of ecosystems, increasingly seeing ecosystems as communication systems that they kind of had feedback loops and could be kind of depicted in the same kind of language, visual language, if we will, and diagrammed as computer systems. So since the Second World War II, cybernetically informed ecologists had built models that understood the world in terms of homeostatically organized network systems. Initially, models grounded in communication sciences, so they were modeled out of these cybernetic ideas of kind of closed world, where the aim was, right, to maintain order and stasis. And events that threw the order off, the idea, ecosystem managers thought the idea was, you know, if a toxin entered the environment, or if an area was deforested, the idea was to kind of try to return it to some original state, or to retain some sort of balanced system. So of course, these models were built and tested in the landscapes of nuclear blast sites. And as a result of their kind of co-production with the Cold War and nuclear weapons, very much kind of bought into kind of closed world notions that kind of replicated Cold War geopolitical ideas. So ecosystems were supposed to make feedback loops that aspired to balance much like the early models of homeostats coming out of communication control, but also the aspirations, right, politically, of not allowing a nuclear war to happen. But also the bomb itself provided a new way of visualizing nature and seeing it. So these are famous studies. So these are the Marshall Islands, where a lot of ecology work started to happen. And of course, there's a whole history here about the island itself as an experimental test bed and American imperial ambitions that sort of course, inform this type of kind of science. But it's also a media technology, nuclear weapons. I often have media studies as a big part of my work, so it's important for me to think about also how we visualize and represent nature as being central to kind of the media systems we produce. And in this case, you can see that these fish, that the radiation from these nuclear blasts actually made visible the pathways of energy and metabolism in the system. So you could actually see energy, both carbon and nitrogen cycles, and kind of moving through the system. And particularly of interest to ODIMs was energy and metabolic systems. So in the fish, you'll see, bigger fish are going to have even more radiation because they ate all the little fish. And so you can actually trace and actually visualize in these sort of feedback loops the entire system. So increasingly, nature came to be seen as visible through these new technologies, both of nuclear and increasingly computational power, and traceable and kind of modelable inside these feedback loops. The kind of culmination of this idea of kind of a homeostatic communication control information nature came with the world model put forth in the Limits to Growth report in 1972. So the most extensive effort at computing the future of the planet and its population, the Limits to Growth modeled just such a closed world with limited resources that had to be perfectly balanced. And the idea being, if we could model and simulate all these feedback loops, we could manage them. The Clarion call to an emergent environmental movement, so there's both really good and really bad things about this sort of situation, where of course the threats and dangers to any issues of toxicity, radiation, biodiversity loss became incredibly visible through the new sciences of ecology, as well as through computational methods. But also, so these computer scientists modeled human behavior and populations as aberrations, producing terminal traumas in the environment that lead to catastrophe. So every single model they ran went really badly. So there was like wars, crisis, people dying, animals dying off. And the answer for them was to restore the balance of the planet through the careful management of these feedback loops. So they said, now that we have this, we have to just manage for sustainability. And so sustainability emerged as kind of the language of the time, to kind of emerge as sort of like, we're going to keep everything nice and balanced, and the careful management of these feedback loops would keep everything, sustainable. But of course, and this, of course, prompted a whole lot of geopolitical and political activism around a kind of nascent environmental movement, arguing constantly for limits to growth, which maybe has interesting resonances with our present. But many ecologists, environmentalists, and economists did not agree with the report, as did many people in the global south and other places, saying, what you're basically arguing is we have to stay the same. And that human action is an aberration, if you will, to nature, and that we have to somehow retrieve some previous state or keep the state going as it is, which lots of people weren't happy with, both from the left and the right. So many ecologists, economists, and economists did not agree with the report. Ecosystems, they argued, did not appear to stabilize after suffering disruption. There could be no going back to some less damaged planet. DDT, for example, had demonstrated the destructive results impacting systems far outside the immediate locus of insect elimination in agriculture. And so this is coincident also with Rachel Carson's report. Agent Orange, heavily used in Vietnam War as a defoliant, and related dioxins were demonstrated to produce long-range impacts in humans and ecosystems. And the list went on. And these things didn't just disappear. It didn't just stop using these dioxins and then like they somehow cleaned up, right? That kind of classic state case study that started to emerge a little bit later, but it's just kind of an exemplar that a lot of people then used later in the 80s as they kind of critique this idea, is the collapse of the cod off the Canadian shore. So the cod seem to be doing all right. They go kind of ballistic in the 70s, and then suddenly there's this crash, and they close George's Bank. They do everything they can, but the cod just don't come back. So this sort of seemed to appear that nature seemed to be constantly evolving. Its systems change, and they just never go back to the system before. And therefore, but it wasn't just ecologists that realized this, of course. At the forefront of the attacks on limits to growth is Friedrich Hayek in his 1974 Nobel Peace Prize. He attacks what he calls a fantasy of control and omniscient knowledge that he feels the economic sciences had taken from the physical sciences. And he argued the enormous publicity recently given to media to a report pronouncing in the name of science, in the name of, but somehow a bad science, the limits to growth, has basically fed this kind of false lie, this devastating criticism. This report is, so even though he argues this report has been devastatingly critiqued, we continue to believe that there's a limit to growth. This fundamentally needs to be debunked. And against this fantasy of being able to control the future and manage it, that he sees limits to growth. So he sees this report as sort of equivalent to what he most hates, i.e. state planning. He reminds us that human activities and the desire to replace it, so that there are spontaneous processes seemingly governed by no one, that there's no desirability, that we have to desire this spontaneity and emergence, which he, of course, makes equivalent to markets. And there's, in other parts of my work, I work a lot on neoliberal kind of thinking and this concept of emergence and networks. But anyway, here we'll just highlight the fact that he sees this fantasy of conscious human control replacing spontaneity and what he equates with like a real nature, the evolutionary potential of the market to make decisions and to adapt to adversity and change without the top-down managerial planning kind of prediction feature of both governments and, in this case, environmentalists. And he reminds us that for Hayek, systems self-organize from these free efforts of millions of individuals, some other pieces of the same Nobel Peace Prize. As a consequence, control understood the prediction of future events, whether by mainstream economists or the Club of Rome, was simply undesirable, impossible, and anti-evolutionary. And I am very interested in the kind of move at this moment where also biological determinism and technological determinism get merged. And that's kind of an ongoing issue also when we start talking about artificial intelligence and big data in our present, where we regularly imbue these systems with seemingly natural attributes. For Hayek, though, this was not a cause for despair, rather it was a grounds for hope. Provided that those populations of millions were allowed to engage in new and unanticipated problems flexibly by means of unrestricted market activity. So only unrestricted market activity would be able to deal with the adversity and volatility of nature. Hayek's lecture focused primarily on the rather abstract realm of epistemology, but later many people would take it much more materially. And I'm going to return to that and the rise of another place we'll see resilience, mainly futures options markets and currencies. But within ecology, a similar discourse also seemed to emerge. And I'm not saying the two are exactly the same, and part of our political project might be tearing them apart. But nonetheless, they seem coincident. In 1972, 1973, sorry, almost a year before Hayek, in a very famous article that is kind of a landmark in ecology, resilience and stability in ecological systems, the Canadian ecologist C.S. Halling, who was involved himself in the forestry industry in Canada, so he was managing natural resources, came up with a new idea about how ecosystems operate. And here you're seeing from that article a series of population projections based on particular possibilities. So you see a range of futures here depending on the behavior of these populations. And this article opens with an astounding statement. Individuals die, populations disappear, and species become extinct. That is one view of the world. But another view of the world concentrates not so much on presence and absence, not on how many species or diversity, as upon the number of organisms, the degree, but the most important word here is the degree of constancy of their numbers. These are two very different ways of viewing the behavior of systems, and the usefulness of this view depends very much on the properties of the systems concerned. So that sounds really exciting. No, it doesn't. We'll unpack it for a moment. That's the problem of making economists and ecologists sound exciting. I mean, Halling here posits a world where change, even catastrophic, even extinction. So it's not the number of species, right? We're not counting stuff anymore in terms of how many things are there. What we're counting is relationships, what we will later call ecosystem services. What we're counting is the degree of constancy, which is the relation between the different species and the operations, if you will, or the processes that they're part of. So extinctions can happen. We can lose some people, we can lose some animals, we can do all these different things. But what we have to really focus on is the behavior of the system. We're not just looking, and different ways of viewing the behavior of systems. Extinctions happen, but systems, decrees, and evolution continue. Rather than focusing on the event of extinction, ecologists instead think about the relationships in a system. The environment itself has to become a system, one that has properties that, like programs, perhaps might be maintained irrespective of the life or death of individuals. This new concept of resilience is part of a new idea about change and events. And here we can see all these kind of future movements inside this. So Halling developed this new concept of resilience to contest the premise that ecosystems were most healthy when they return quickly to an equilibrium state after being disturbed. And most importantly, his concept that it's okay that we have disequilibrium was reflected and refactored at almost the same time by Milton Friedman in a famous argument that in 1971, that a major need for a broad, widely based, active, and resilient futures market had to emerge out of the end of Bretton Woods. So for Friedman, much like Halling, or perhaps Friedman impacts Halling, this collapse of the Bretton Woods system was not a calamity, but an opportunity for creating a new, what he labeled, resilient system of international currency exchange. And in this article, the need for futures markets and currencies, Friedman acknowledged that in the absence of an international system of monetary controls, currency controls, exchange rates would shift constantly in relationship to one another. The architects of Bretton Woods had seen such volatility as a problem, since it meant those engaged in foreign trade would have to take significant risks that the currency in which the trade was negotiated might depreciate by the time payments were made. Bretton Woods thus sought to institute a system of rigidly fixed exchange rates that do not change. However, as Friedman noted, they ended up with a system of rigidly fixed rates subject to large jumps from time to time, and these large jumps eventually broke what was designed to be a rigid system of control. Friedman argued that the solution under these conditions is not another rigidly controlled system, but instead this future market that, in his words, would be resilient, is a system that might allow those engaged in foreign trade to hedge the risks. So in order to create these options for the future, you could kind of hedge or kind of try to anticipate or quantify or bank in on the volatilities between currencies. And his argument was that if everybody did this, this would create its own balance through kind of a market of exchange that, much like this system of nature would kind of allow evolution and adaptation through volatility. So he has, but Milton Friedman slightly differs from Holling in the sense that his idea is a sort of idea of stable change, that if we keep these markets are like an infrastructure that will allow change to happen, but without the kind of extremes of something like the Great Depression, or so monetism fantasizes. We'll see if that happens. But coming back to ecology, for Holling, the question then, very much like for money managers, was very much about how to manage these systems that are now understood to be constantly volatile and all the time changing. So we're dealing with these similar ideas. And for Holling, the idea that his idea was that A, systems are always changing, but B, he argued one of the problems is our model. It's like just having a model of GNP or GDP, it's a problem, he argued. And the problem is that we overemphasize in the previous idea about Darwinian evolution and kind of linear evolution, we overemphasize just things like predator-prey relationships, and we often ignore more complex interactions, such as nitrogen, carbon, and other cycles, interactions of mutual aid collaboration, or competition between many species, not so like maybe ecosystems compete with one another, or maybe like rats, cockroaches, and humans compete with some other ecosystem of animals, right? So that these kind of things can't be dealt with if we're only looking at survival and fitness in a very reduced way and only counting the number of animals or things alive and not the processes of the system. So for him, a myriad of other factors might permit ecosystems to persevere in their functions even in mutated or varied forms. So extinction might not be a limit to growth or change of a system unless it fundamentally transformed a complex web of interactions. So basically he argued, we could have extinctions in an ecosystem, but the system would still persevere. So one type of tree. So what we're looking at, so for example, this is a topographical map of a boreal forest, and it's about forest management problems. And interestingly enough, also, resilience emerged with, again, new information infrastructures, particularly in this case, satellite. GIS and GPS were first developed in Canada around these forestry management. Well, not just first, there were military systems, but they got deployed, obviously, in weather meteorology and similar problems. And geographic information systems very much saw themselves realized in sort of this context. And so these are some of the first mappings, and what you're seeing here is different population, you probably can't see it well, different population densities of three types: pine, fir, and pine, fir, and I don't know if it's oak trees, and these budworms in a Canadian forest. So one of the things he noted is that the absence, spruce trees. Then the actual number of spruce is not important. What's important is the ability of the forest to rejuvenate. And so you constantly see certain levels of different populations dropping, sometimes almost dropping out entirely before kind of recycling. So you constantly have to have different types of trees and different types of budworms. You can't just have one tree and one budworm. So the system is regularly changing. In general, this allows the forest as a forest to continue existing, even if at certain moments you might have no fir trees or no birch trees or whatever, no budworms. For other systems, one might imagine different processes or processes defining them. And today, of course, we've turned this idea of like that the forest is a service into ecosystem services. And as I mentioned, this comes with new infrastructures around surveillance and data management. And like resilience itself comes as a possibility of how systems can themselves change under periods of intense external perturbation, but still persist, if you will, in their capacity to be. And as a result of these models, This also changed how we manage ecosystems. So managers would emphasize the need to keep options open, the need to view events in a regional rather than local context, and the need to emphasize heterogeneity. And there's a couple things I want to say there that might or might not jive with the economic understandings. Interestingly enough, of course, this sounds a lot like Angus Haggerty in Davos, also kind of emphasizing similar things, except maybe not the diversity feature. So so resilience has a couple things that we might know. First, it's a new kind of geographic or territorial idea. It's not just that there's the new territory in space, both in terms of mapping systems and also seeing the forest, but it's about transforming in scale from, that we move away from just like one plot of land to thinking regionally, maybe even at the state planetarily, right? Because we're kind of trying to track these processes and interactions. It's also obviously a new type of management. So this is like a contemporary. So these ideas of resilience through hauling very quickly became a language of what is now known as adaptive management, that you have to be able to kind of create these feedback loops and constantly have these emergent kind of flexible plastic ideas. And very central to this idea, and the final idea of heterogeneity and diversity, I'm going to come back to, but it's very important, so just hold it. This is also a new epistemology. And it's one that closely mirrors Hayek's ideas, and neoliberal ideas that already came from the early 1940s. Although, again, I think these two come from different places. So the convergence, we have to ask how similar it is and whether there's place to play in between them, or like an important role of pulling these things apart. But the basic point is this is an epistemology of ignorance, or how to stop worrying and start managing. It's sort of an epistemology best, sort of like it's a very Rumsfeldian epistemology where there's kind of known knowns, known unknowns, and just unknown unknowns. And Holling literally says, flowing from this this question of the constant evolutionary logic of ecosystems, managers have to start approaching the world in recognition of their ignorance, not the assumption that future events are expected, but that they will be unexpected. That's the whole point. There's going to be extinction. There's going to be volatility. There's going to be forest fires. Bad things are like, this system is never going to stay stable. You have to begin figuring out how to create managerial strategies that are literally built for ignorance. Of course, this very closely links to this new idea also emerging in economy about basically the idea that that I mentioned before, that Hayek talked about, that systems emerge out of the free efforts of millions of individuals without planning and without direction. So these new ideas of a constantly volatile world that has to be managed but not planned. So then to end up, I'm going to talk about what it means, is kind of emerging at exactly this moment in the 70s. And of course, this closely parallels, and in many ways, one must see these managerial strategies, both of commodities, right? We're still talking about wood, fish, energy, these kind of things, as well as finance, are happening within a context, right, of decolonization, where increasingly decolonial or post-colonial struggles are kind of either nationalizing resources, but creating a lot of variability in prices in the market. The context, at least for urban planners and in the US, of kind of racial violence and post-civil rights disruption, but also the kind of contest from the right coming against civil rights, and things like the 1970 the oil embargo, and the kind of petrodollar crisis that ended Bretton Woods. And in turn, part of these managerial strategies were in environment, but we're also in economics. I do a lot of work in other places on things like the Black-Scholes derivative pricing equation for options, which are exactly the kind of mathematical technologies that actually account for algorithmic technologies that kind of helped fuel the computerization of the market, but helped negotiate fluctuating commodity and currency prices, and allowed people to compile and hedge risk at increasingly planetary, or what Holling might call regional scales. So these are kind of the technologies of management under which they kind of accompany, if you will, a discourse of resilience. So there's 3 summary points I want to underscore before turning to end and thinking about what all this means. The first is that resilience within this genealogy assumes, of course, uncertainty and volatility as perhaps normal conditions. Stability and resilience are not equivalent. So stable systems and resilient systems are not one and the same. As a corollary, the life and death of individuals, even populations, is secondary to the ongoing evolution of systems. Second, resilience was a new way to model the world and therefore also measure it. Instead of taxonomy and organizing populations into stable categories, one had to define systems in terms of processes. And I have like a little kind of ecosystem chart behind that kind of gives you a sense of the way people started rethinking systems, not in terms of numbers of animals or numbers of species, but in terms of processes. And if all this seems pretty standard today, I take a moment just to say that a lot of these techniques and technologies had to develop in order for us to be able to manage and think about systems this way, as well as aesthetics. The measure and relationship between populations and potentially other factors, nitrates, carbon, energy, is what mattered. And a corollary to this new approach is that past data could be used to build concepts, but wasn't actually predictive. There was always probabilities. There's a level of uncertainty and emergence at scale that can't be directly predicted from your past data. So there's so in turn, especially for ecologists, emphasize heterogeneity and diversity, therefore, as very important to facilitating resilience. And this is a key point where maybe ecology and economics diverge, or maybe they're the same. We can talk about what they mean. And what it would mean to have a robust and maybe a definition of diversity here. But for ecosystem management, if you're too perfectly, there's a kind of weird contradiction that's also true for supply chains and came out just now when we have these battles between just in time and just in case. Supply chain management, for example, when there's a war or when a tsunami hits all your things, is that if you're too optimized, you can't adjust. So, and in genomics and in biodiversity, if there's not enough excess in the system, if you will, if there's not extra material, the system can't adapt because you don't know what's coming. So there has to be, that's if you're too perfectly adapted to your like little ecological niche and a new animal comes in or the temperature changes, you can't modify yourself or your behavior, your body. So there's a kind of contradictory question about how to calibrate the amount of diversity with a kind of questions of optimization and efficiency that kind of managing both ecosystems and economies tends to develop. So this is kind of interesting. So resilience fluctuates between the 2 poles of Darwinian evolutionary theory, which is survival of the fittest, and the necessity for variety and diversity within between populations to allow for adaptability. So perfect optimization might come at the cost of adaptation. And so there's a question. So managing for resilience also vacillates between other debates involved in evolution, mainly nature or nurture, except that this has been reformulated in terms of scales or code and context. You focus on a single genome, an entire landscape of biodiversity. The term allows all these things to advance. And of course, today, we have things like ecosystem services that have emerged directly out of Holling's work, and it's kind of transforms, obviously, the way we understand plants. You know, you can see here all these this kind of systems view, and increasingly the processes that comprise an ecosystem are called services and are usually financialized or economized. But of course, resilience also allows us to rethink territory and geography. So these, for example, are mappings of what we call ecosystem bundles around different cities. And you can see here the way that the rural, urban, and hinterlands are being kind of rethought in terms of which areas, even some across India are kind of being reorganized in terms of their relations to one another. So there's new territorial features. So as I mentioned, so to kind of end our kind of conception about how and what resilience is doing. So coming into our present, after 9/11, basically returning to resilience, after 9/11, and the many, and all these, and the kind of trauma, or not trauma, I guess trauma for some, but not for others, the language of resilience became kind of omnipresent. So following 9/11 and the 2008 financial crisis and climate change, resilience has taken a central discursive place in fields ranging from business management and logistics to psychology, adaptive management, business continuity management, climate resiliency planning, and many related terms are all direct outgrowths from ecological resilience and largely shape our understandings of how changing climate and security conditions are to be dealt with. So a search online in the aftermath of COVID-19 and the war in Ukraine, and probably now after in lieu of the current events in the Middle East, reveals a massive number of articles, websites, and consulting service dedicated to these questions. And in fact, every single company in America today, or most major corporations, as part of their kind of stock portfolios, have to have resilience programs. And here's like a classic case. This is New York during Hurricane Sandy. I don't know if anyone knows which the gleaming gold building is. Goldman Sachs. So if we thought that the ecosystem of Lower Manhattan's main goal was finance, the important thing is that the finance part keeps going even as the public housing projects go down. But of course, in the wake of all these events, we see the essence of resilience business after COVID-19, supply chain disruption that we have to manage, and increasingly the introduction. I don't have time to talk about this, but if you want, you can ask me, of artificial intelligence and digital twinning as major sources. So here's a global leader in AI-powered procurement and supply chain transformation, and the idea that big data and and kind of AI will allow you to immediately immediately restructure and reorganize supply chains and business processes in order to adapt for an immediately volatile or violent situations. So we've seen a move in general from just-in-time manufacturing to just-in-case, and corporations are urged to increase their options, diversify supply chains geographically, and we see that renaturalization, and begin thinking about plasticity in manufacturing infrastructure, so being able to make alternative products and to identify vital services and processes ahead of time. And the idea is that by having digital twins and kind of artificial intelligence systems that can kind of constantly collect real-time data and project into kind of small near futures that can be macro managed, that companies can be better and better at this. Of course, there's a violence to the discourse of resilience, and for many neoliberal and right-leaning politicians, resilience is also a call to expend populations they do not value, as was incredibly visible throughout COVID-19, and perhaps now in many of the wars, where the elderly, people with underlying health conditions, people of color, were regularly kind of sacrificed in the interest of keeping the economy resilient, or keeping certain vital services going, whether they were vital or not. This opens us to a question of other possibilities. What are the other potentials of resilience, or do we have to even throw it out as a term? Here we contend with how we understand evolution and genealogy. So financial and logistical comprehensions of resilience largely assume a world of scenario plans and unanticipated futures divorced from historical legacy or context. And in this case, we might think about how people have thought about it otherwise, as the race theorist Carrot Keeling. So one place where resilience also emerges is in discourses and movements like Black Lives Matter, where I think resilience has come to mean as more like a recognition that for people of color in the United States, violence and volatility are constants. Precarity is a constant, but it's something that both does not subsume or that they can kind of rise above and still kind of exceed while at the same time recognizing that violence. And I think this is one of the questions that involves resilience, whether it has that ability. Resilience, of course, also is a radical transformation about how we think about infrastructure and how we think about living with others. So this is kind of a classic case of hard infrastructure, the kind of draining of the Everglades in the 30s as part of the New Deal, as a way to water manage. And of course, now there's these kind of idealized, I'm not saying that Miami is ever going to do this, and we don't particularly, and Florida is kind of a reactionary state where apparently climate change isn't happening, but imagine that, you know, these kind of ideas of making resilience by letting water in, by kind of creating a porousness between the environment and the city. These are the sort of potentials, right, that might be unlocked through an ecological understanding of futures with or through these new concepts, particularly around biodiversity. And I'll kind of end with this question. We can move on to conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I will have questions, I'm sure, and comments and possible objection. Who wants to start?
Should I stop the share or?
And also,
Yeah, you can stop it or
yeah, please.
Well, I don't know if people are online and I need to show some.
Now, guys, who is online? They disappeared.
yeah, they're online.
Huh?
What?
Or they might be a.
Yes,
student.
They're online.
Yes,
They're online.
Mhm.
Okay.
Is this
You see them? Like,
Yeah, I'm the host.
Yeah.
go on.
Maybe I should start.
Yeah, please.
Okay. Thank you for your presentation. It's a nice one. Thank you so much. I like this slide where you show that diversity is equal to resilience, and was really impressed with that. Because many times when we talk about resilience, especially in climate change, IPCC circle, they usually tend it towards, yeah, decarbonization, fine, and then bringing the future into it, that we need to develop a kind of resilience against climate change. And I like it when you also look at it that from people from developed world, looking at resilience is a little bit complex for them. They want to develop.
Of course.
Now we have about 2 countries now in West Africa that are now developing their own indigenous refinery to refine oil. And now doing that against developing resilience against climate change is also complex. They want to develop. And from developed country, they are saying that going towards that now, in order to reduce the carbon emission into the atmosphere to enhance resilience, developing refinery is not the option. But they too want to develop their economy. So I like the way you put it, but still, diversity, resilience, and economy for developing country is a little bit complex. I don't know how you see that.
Well,
I'm sorry.
coming back, no, I think that's an excellent question. I'm not sharing the slide, but I think there's a lot to be said. This isn't, of course, global, north-south question. This is internal to the, or maybe it is. There's south. There are many souths, many north. But I think it demonstrates the basic question about also the, like, who's supposed to be resilient and where the cost of resilience, like that, the problem with resilience, and for the most part, I have to say, I really struggle with this term in any positive sense, and that I feel like we have to come up with another one, both because of its history of proximity to neoliberal thinking, as well as sometimes reactionary politics, but also the way it's just become that resilience is something like poor people are supposed to be, Black people are supposed to be resilient. Like they're supposed to be able to take all the shock, suffer, and still come up okay, right? Like that certain populations are expected to be resilient and others, I guess, are not, and that it offsets the kind of responsibility for managing crisis on the most precarious. Why? Because very rarely, but that's also why I kind of showed this question of infrastructure, like what are the infrastructures we might produce that might produce greater levels of care or equity. Usually what we do is we say, you know, resilience is either a personal or individual characteristic, or, you know, it's that we can't do anything to stop the crisis. So the assumption is bad things are going to happen, and now you've got to figure out how to deal with it. But of course, bad things don't happen fairly to everyone. They disproportionately happen to some and not to others. And so in some sense, by naturalizing the bad thing, rather than saying, hey, how could we build structures, infrastructures that wouldn't allow that crisis to happen in the first place, we've shifted the conversation to like post-destruction management or post-catastrophic management. And so fundamentally, I think that we need some maybe new concepts for thinking about. But then I think also it always comes back also to questions of metrics. What do we measure? How do we measure? What do we think success or failure is? And how do we see and understand systems, even ecosystems, or even systems, for example, between Western African nations or East African nations and, you know, carbon control, and how we're kind of modeling and understanding those things, because you know, the other, and this enters this whole conversation about growth, degrowth, and these other things. But it's absolutely understandable that people, because that, but the other solution or the other question that's also really interesting, I had a whole section, but I was going so slow. But this is a corporation. You know, there's also the question of technology, you know, and sort of some people are like, you know, that maybe these ideas of constant change also allow us to be thinking more differently about what it means to develop, you know, and how to, and what kind of technologies and what forms of life do we want. I think that's also a key point. So I don't know if that answered any question, but it's a super valid and super important point. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the presentation, first and foremost. I was skimming through your website, the one that was linked, and I would want more clarification maybe on how boring infrastructures, as you put it, are applicable to solidarity, and why do you think that concept is significant?
I mean, I didn't write that piece, so I want to emphasize. So I didn't get to this, but I have a project called, I don't know if it's a good name. We keep debating it, but it's caught on. Called Against Catastrophe, which is a network of designers, artists, academics trying to think about how we imagine infrastructures for non-catastrophic or non-crisis futures, which seems kind of like an insane project at the moment. And our goal is not to say that crisis and catastrophe doesn't happen. We're all about historical recognition of violence, but it's about the fact that the way we design, or most of us design, or let's say in the global north, but I think in many places, design is around securitization and kind of defensible space against kind of negative futures that we continue to think we can't stop and so what does it mean to kind of counter those forms? And I guess another term is to think about what one of my postdocs calls counter futuring. And I think that like I said, not every piece that we run is something I'm in support of or necessarily adhere. It's a forum, but they're thinking about, so that issue was done by one of my postdocs who works on smart borders and migration. And I think it was Bern, I'm trying to remember who exactly, but their argument, I think, was a little bit about the language of crisis. And I think there's a real question always about the work terms like crisis and catastrophe, and have in either in how we manage those events, as whether they're singular or whether we understand them as structural and patterned, and at what location and scale and temporality we make interventions. And I think one of the things they were trying to argue is that, and they were maybe problematically, I myself am not haven't, but I think it'd be an interesting discussion, but they argued essentially that the way the Ukrainian refugees were taken in versus the way refugees coming from Africa or Islamic countries was radically different. And that a big part of that difference is a lot of times the way and whether or not the refugee, like whether the geopolitical problem or catastrophe that is the war in Ukraine, whether that shifts to being whether the immigration is seen as a crisis or a catastrophe for the incoming countries or not. So what's interesting about the terrible violence and really the catastrophe of the Syrian civil war was the way that got deflected, like away from the question of the war itself to the problem of immigration for Europe in their account, you know. So for them, they want it to be understood that it's a structural feature that Europe has to take or should take. They want a world where immigrants are regularly let in and given rights and as citizens accepted into Europe as in one case they were, and in another case this was a site of incredible debate, and for the most part they often aren't. So I think their main argument about making immigration boring is the effort to make immigration not a constant crisis for the EU, but rather an accepted and normalized condition, and one that of course is and should, I mean, of course one can accept and normalize it in a bad way too. So I think they are urging for forms of solidarity and care as a kind of standard act, understanding that there's a regular number, you know, this is a regular event, it's not a unique and unusual crisis. And again, this comes to the problem of resilience as a discourse about whether or not, because, you know, it can how it's mobilizing to normalize certain geopolitical events, war, the climate crisis, etc., and whether that's a good or bad thing, you know, because there's also something that seems really, really pragmatic about saying the climate crisis is really happening, so let's start dealing structurally and infrastructurally rather than just like case by case, oh whoa, there was another hurricane. But there's also kind of a terrifying feature where doing that, you know, can we only care for people if there's a crisis, if it's couched as that, or, you know, these are the kind of, I think, underlying questions at stake.
Well, because you mentioned the war in Ukraine, did it actually change the way, for example, Europeans think about resilience? And did it change the way how, for example, African countries or Latin American countries think about resilience? And if no, a little bit like a following question, is it actually possible to have something like global resilience, bearing in mind that geographically we all are facing different problems and challenges, and also we have cultural diversities and stuff?
I mean, one, I want to say I'm not a particular expert in Europe. Actually, but I can't really tell you that I haven't been tracking like that much about like EU policies. What I have been tracking, and I can't speak for every country in the world and how they're negotiating this particular scenario. It's very evident, of course, that different countries have had radically different responses. They work a bit in India. You know, they've been buying Russian oil. This is not an, you know, their view of the world is not coincident. You know, Modi doesn't have a problem with Putin. You know, whatever you want to say about that. So these are different choices, and and people have mobilized it. I mean, right after the Ukraine war, you saw the return of something that had gone away for a while. Last time was, you know, the Asian currency crisis, and it was the macro hedge fund. I mean, people came back in and were currency bidding, and people were buying up rubles day after the war because it just dived, and they made a killing. So, you know, different people have obviously responded to this really differently. And I think for me, inside Europe, at least from European corporations, which is where most of what I know is, if anything, is that I do a bunch of projects on artificial intelligence implementation in different systems. And so I know a lot about the GDPR, the AI Act, stuff like that. And I would say there's enormous discussion about, I mean, that the concern about security and AI is massive, and it was there always, but the Ukraine war kind of put it at the forefront as one of the most digitally mediated conflicts until maybe the current one between Israel and Gaza. I don't know. I don't know what it might still be more mediated, actually, to be honest. I mean, the levels of memes, hacks, etc. was massive. So there's obviously securitization around systems, and for corporations, you know, I think this really, it just exacerbated what COVID-19 had already made. And well, it started with the tsunami, earthquake. I mean, not just started, but the intensification of these events for people who have to manage supply chains, and then the geopolitics with China has increased profoundly. And that's front and center. You can read about chip wars and this wars, and everybody is deeply concerned. So I think you have seen a kind of entrenchment and a real shift in terms of these technologies and particular modes of managing it, actually, through the particular set of techniques and technologies. So that's all I can say, but it's, I mean, sadly, it's becoming like the only thing.
Any questions online?
Not yet.
Yes, I have a couple of questions, I guess, about the word resilience. So resilience is that basically resilience is about, here is a crisis or some kind of disturbance, some kind of trouble, and we're getting back to business as usual as it was, so that we're resilient. That's resilience. And I think it's not the right, really. It's not there is such attitude. It's very widespread attitude. Like you showed us Goldman Sachs working through the night on resilience and growth, and if not growth, at least resilience. But I think our task really is to try to find another concept or concepts that would actually be attractive to people, and first of all attractive to us here, that would sort of embrace this new reality.
Although I do want to say one thing. Resilience is not about business. On one hand, I mean, it depends on your frame and your scale and your temporality. And, you know, if you're a Marxist or neoliberal, whatever, you know, there's different frames. But from an ecology purpose, it's not going back to the previous. It's, the system is not the same. It may still have trees, but there will be different trees. There will be, and in fact, eventually systems change entirely. It's about managing that shift. There's no, for example, if you work in mine reclamation, they talk a lot about resilience and reclamation. like increasingly people recognize like you can't go back, like, or with Chernobyl, like you can't go back. There's nothing, there is an ecosystem, it's definitely radically changed. There's a bunch of new genes running, you know, there's a whole series of mutations, it's rewilded, but it's not going to be the exact same thing back. And maybe people can't ever come back there. The same thing is happening all over the world. We have to deal with inhabiting toxic landscapes that are just not going to be untoxic ever. And so then the question, which is why I kind of didn't quite get to talk about this sort of stuff. You're getting these like biotech companies that are going to hybridize like extinct stuff. They're going to increase diversity at a genomic level to be able to withstand these changes. But so on one hand, yes, it's business as usual in the sense of keeping maybe an extractive economy going, keeping a certain service going, feeding people. I mean, some of it's not terrible, like worrying about crop or food security. You know, these are problems that we have to deal with. So there's something strange happening here about what we choose to keep the same and what we choose to say we can allow to die or go extinct or evolve, and those are political questions. However, for the reasons you say, I think in most cases it's very often taken in its most reductive sense and largely about how do we keep business as usual going, but still with huge amounts of violence. Like you are letting things go extinct, you are deciding which people are or which species or what should or should not survive. These are the constant ecosystem and of course political decisions are getting made. So the question is, does resilience end up naturalizing violence in a way that doesn't allow structural changes to happen? And then do we need a new language? And I am kind of with you that we actually need new concepts around evolution and change that might maybe have a little less of a biologically determinist veneer.
Yeah, very good. So what kind of concept would it be? Because in some cases, this kind of resilience has returned to the pre-existing status. In some cases, it does work, like it worked with the COVID. We have kind of successfully returned to the pre-existing status. We'll say it should work with, say, demining the Ukrainian battlefields. So the war would stop at some point, so everything should be demined. So ideally, it should just return to the pre-existing condition. It would take, you know, years and years and whatever, billions of dollars. But if it happens, that would be resilience, say Ukrainian resilience, okay. But on the other hand, like in your example with the golf course, so golf course would be converted into a wet park. So of course, this wet park is not the same swamp that was there in Florida before with crocodiles or whatever, but it would be closer to that swamp, right, than the golf course. But I just want to finish this. So now we have a wet park, but of course the golf course needed permanent care, like mowing, you know, watering it all, lots of fuel, lots of water, lots of labor, and the water park does not need it. Largely, basically, it needs a fence probably, and that's all. And then it should work like homeostatically, just being sustainable by its natural laws. So all the jobs will disappear, gardeners, whatever. Coaches, golf coaches, you know, security people, many jobs, like a whole village probably. So basically, it does lead to degrowth. Very simple example, but it necessarily leads to degrowth. But the growth, of course, is not a, not an attractive concept. So basically, it's I think this is not resilience. Like the mining of the battlefield is about resilience, but converting a golf course is not about resilience. It's about maybe like controlled decline or something like that. Just there should be some kind of concept that would indeed normalize or even aestheticize, I would say, this kind of decline or going down.
I mean, I'm not sure. I guess I'm not sure. Or perhaps I failed in my talk. I think there's multiple understandings of resilience, and it can be taken like the Ukrainian. It could be controlled decline. And resilience doesn't have a linear, like when we talk about, and I didn't have time to get into like contemporary evolutionary theories like symbiosis or Gaia theory or things like that. And they're deeply debated. I'm not saying they're correct or whatever. I'm just saying these are models of the world people are putting out right now, or in the last, say, 50 years. They're not, like, evolution is not teleological. It's not better, or controlled decline could be something you do to supposedly be resilient because you still want to keep your city there. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's nothing for ecologists, like resilience could be about letting parts of the system degrade on purpose. That could be fine. For the Ukrainians, that might not be acceptable. So people are understanding things differently. For corporations, obviously, like, they need to keep their bottom line. They need to grow. So it's not acceptable to say, so when they're talking about resilience in supply chains, it's not resilience without growth. It's resilience with growth. It's to keep the growth going. So, I mean, I think you posit an interesting point, but I think for the very reason that you posit, for the most part, I wonder whether resilience is redeemable or not as a term, because so often it's understood in the way you're arguing, as a sort of return to a previous state or something. And other words that we might want to think about are these questions of reparation, reclamation. I mean, there's a lot of words coming around that people have been kind of throwing about in terms of how to think about managing environments and systems or dealing with futurity without kind of, or even speculation. I mean, resilience is a really depressing discourse. It's not particularly like speculative, even from an environmental sense. Like it's really about management.
I think it's more than that. I mean, it's nobody likes it. I mean, the Ukrainians wouldn't like it if their fields would remain in that horrible condition with mines, and the Florida people would also not like it because they would lose their jobs and whatever.
But they might not lose their jobs because there's also I don't know, these are experimental wetlands that they're building in the Charles River in Boston, my northeastern, and
this is very nice.
Yeah, and they're trying to clean the river using these new fake wetlands that will also, of course, provide stuff for birds and stuff. And maybe it's not a previous thing, but there weren't that many people cleaning the river anyway, and there weren't that many people managing. I mean, and it's not clear, and this isn't really, and there weren't that many people working golf courses compared to the number of people that are now going to have to do water monitoring and environmental sensing. And so there's definitely there's industries around supposedly resilient design just like there are, will it take, I mean, there are all these questions about de-skilling and retraining and whether or not anyway we should be moving off of a labor model of economy and just giving everyone a living wage and calling it a day. And certainly in Florida, it's all about real estate anyway. But I mean, you pose really important questions I don't have answers to, but I wouldn't say it automatically means that more or less people are employed, because there's a lot of care that goes into all these systems, because none of these wetlands will just exist for themselves.
Yeah, I agree. And we don't know, we're not economists, so we cannot really calculate, the costs and benefits of this transformation. But we're dealing with wars, and I think there should be some kind of conceptual work done for reimagining this process, and also redescribing this process, using some kind of new attractive words, or coining this kind of new language that would make this transformation more attractive to everyone.
I mean, I think it'd be, I want to hear more from you, not having only looked at like what corporations did after Ukraine and the heightened issues with China. You saw a huge renationalization of industry, you saw a lot of reorganization of people's supply chains and chip manufacturing and all these things, as well as energy strategies, liquid natural gas terminals popping up in one day, kind of a huge zeal now for hydrogen and so you're seeing stuff happening, and it's been very interesting. There's been a huge discourse of resilience around the Ukrainians as a people in the face of this, and to be honest, it would be super interesting to just hear from you how it's playing out in terms of dealing with this war, because I haven't been really looking at the discourse of resilience as it pertains, except that the New York Times regularly produces this vision of the Ukrainians themselves as resilient.
Yeah. More questions, guys? No? Nothing.
Oh, there is a question in the chat. You can unmute yourself. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you very much. I have a question, and it's not going to be very well framed because your talk is making me thinking about so many things at once. It's very fascinating. Thank you very much. And I wanted to ask about the ethical foundation and power in this resilience problem, because if I understand your attempt to make us see resilience in the political economy of resilience, or there is always an entity that is collecting knowledge and that is producing some kind of decisions to act upon a situation. And I wonder there, how can that play with democratic decisions, or if it doesn't call for a new ethical foundation, because then obviously growth and the protection of what already exists comes from specific cultural and ethical visions of nature, the world, the relationship between nature and humans. I'm sorry, it's a bit going in all directions, but thank you so much. This is really, really interesting.
Thank you. I mean, can you hear me, by the way? It's okay. First, that's an excellent, I think you're asking like a broader question that I don't know if I have like one answer to right now. But one of the things that haunts the whole discourse of the Anthropocene is where we cite, of course, this perhaps not yet existing category of the human and human agency. So one of the the enduring questions as we put together, as we kind of conjoin essentially biological discourses with political economy, is sort of, yeah, where does the agency happen? And again, this comes back, I guess, to what Alexander is kind of pushing us to think about, that we need a different language, because fundamentally this one is deeply, deeply invested in these much longer running evolutionary discourses that tend to erase questions of maybe agency and decision making that are fundamental, or I think are pretty fundamental to politics in general, but to democracy perhaps in particular. Like whether things become seemingly inevitable, or whether they're understood to be constructed by institutions and organizations that are not perhaps created by all people equivalently. Obviously, certain people have more power or less, but there's not even a discussion about that once we start naturalizing a system as kind of operating in the realm of the biological or kind of evolutionary biological discussion. So the interesting thing about resilience is it's incredible permeability between ecology and economy, but that arguably, of course, erases, or in the ecological discourse, there's clearly an argument of management, but both of them, run on this epistemology of ignorance that is not at all about kind of reason, judgment, and planning, or kind of decision making. And so the antagonism in certain ways to that also to be critiqued older histories of reason and liberal subjectivity, obviously. So the nice thing is the critique, but the problem thing is what comes instead of it, and what kind of agency does kind of thinking this way facilitate or not. And I think that's one of the reasons that we've kind of been talking about the possibility of either eliminating the discourse of resilience entirely in name of something, I don't know, more proactive, and maybe care center, I don't know, reparation or or something else, or what kind of concepts we have to come that, or is there a way to think about resilience that recognizes the agency and the importance of the biodiversity and all these other things, but also does not pretend animals don't really vote yet.
Not yet.
Well, in the US, I think you might win if someone would give your dog a vote. I kind of laugh about it, but unfortunately not. You don't know how Americans love their dogs. But
elected the mayor, but I'm not quite sure.
yeah.
Also, mosquitoes will vote, if animals vote. Mosquitoes will vote.
So there's lots of things that could happen, but right now don't. And but themselves could be a political problem, since at least in Western culture, the polis is was originally, if I understand the Greek definition, not that I always want to return to the Greeks, and not that they have the best ontologies or anything, but at least within this tradition of political decision making, the polis was that cut nature from culture, right? And sort of separated human decision making from outside. So these obviously, like the Anthropocene, create enormous challenges. But I don't have any answers on that, but it's an excellent question.
Okay, excellent questions. Very, very, very difficult answers, but we will keep thinking about that.
Well, if I had the answer to all of them, I mean, that world would probably look pretty different. I don't know.
Well, thank you very much for it.
Thank you. Should I?
So there is a small reception, hopefully waiting for us over there.